Part 2. The North American Transition and Academic Foundation, 1989 to 1995. Chapter 11. The Canadian Frontier, Hard Labor and Identity Shifting. The boiler was approximately the size of a small room, and it had not been cleaned in a period of time that the foreman at the lumber mill communicated with the specific combination of apology and challenge that employers deploy when they are about to ask someone to do something genuinely unpleasant. The slight wince, the emphasis on the hourly rate, the studied casualness with which the protective equipment is mentioned, as though it is optional rather than the difference between completing the shift and requiring medical attention. The interior of an industrial boiler that has been operating without maintenance for an extended period is coated with a residue that heat and pressure have transformed from its original form into something considerably more tenacious. A calcium silicate compound, in the specific case of wood processing operations, that adheres to the metal surfaces with the commitment of something that has decided to become part of the structure rather than merely a byproduct of its operation. To remove it requires physical entry into the boiler, which requires the person doing the removing to compress themselves into a space designed for combustion rather than human occupation, equipped with a tool appropriate to the task and a suit appropriate to the residue, and to work in conditions of heat and confinement and chemical exposure that most people offered the hourly rate and the alternative of any other available employment would decline. Elon Musk took the job. The rate was $18 an hour, which in the summer of 1989 represented a significant premium over the alternatives available to a 17-year-old with a South African secondary school certificate and no North American work history. And the premium was, in the Muskian calculus, the relevant variable. The discomfort was a constant, a fixed cost of the work that did not vary with how he felt about it, and therefore did not require extensive emotional processing. He had been in conditions of physical discomfort before. The Veld School had provided a comprehensive introduction to the experience of the body being asked to perform beyond what comfort would permit, and the Bryanston years had demonstrated, with the blunt pedagogy of concrete stairs, that physical experience could be far worse than an industrial boiler and survivable. He put on the suit. He entered the boiler. He worked. 3 days in, of the 30 the job required, the crew of workers assigned to the cleaning had reduced from the initial complement to Elon and 2 others, the majority having performed the personal calculation that $18 an hour was not adequate compensation for what $18 an hour was asking them to do, and having arrived at a conclusion different from Elon's. He has described this episode in interviews with the flat, anecdote-sharing quality of someone reporting a data point rather than narrating a formative experience, though it is, of course, both. Canada, in the summer of 1989, was in the specific economic condition of a country that had just made a large and controversial bet on its own future. The Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement had come into effect in January of that year, the product of years of negotiation and months of political combat sufficiently intense that the 1988 federal election had been fought almost entirely on the single question of whether the agreement was a prudent integration with the inevitable gravitational pull of the American economy, or a surrender of Canadian economic sovereignty to a neighbor that would not hesitate to exploit the asymmetry of their sizes. Brian Mulroney's Progressive Conservatives had won the election, and with it the mandate to implement the agreement. But the winning had not resolved the underlying anxiety, the sense, particularly in the industrial communities that expected to bear the immediate costs of American competition, that the country was changing faster than its citizens had consented to, and in directions that the people most exposed to those changes had not chosen. For a 17-year-old South African arriving in this environment, with a Canadian passport and no other institutional anchors, the economic climate was both challenging and, in a specific way, clarifying. The jobs available to someone in Elon's position, without Canadian work history, without a North American university credential, without the social network that converts informal connections into employment opportunities, were the jobs that the formal economy was least able to automate, and that the workers with more established credentials and more developed alternatives were least willing to perform. The boiler cleaning job. The farm labor on the relative's land in Saskatchewan, where the work was agricultural and physical, and organized around the imperatives of the harvest rather than the preferences of the laborer. The series of positions he moved through in the months between his arrival and his enrollment at Queen's University were not, in any conventional sense, the positions his Pretoria education had been designed to prepare him for. They were, in the structural sense of what they required and what they revealed, something more useful than that. The core conflict of this chapter operates on two levels simultaneously, and both levels matter. The surface-level conflict is practical. Elon needed money, did not have it, was in a country where his existing credentials did not translate directly into the employment that would have generated it, and was required to solve this problem with the resources actually available to him rather than the resources he would eventually have. This is a conflict with a clear operational logic and a clear operational resolution. You take the available work, you do it thoroughly, you accumulate the capital required for the next stage, and you move on. Elon solved it with the efficiency the operational logic demanded, and the solving is not particularly complicated to describe. The deeper conflict is more interesting and more consequential. It is the conflict between the self-conception that Elon had arrived in Canada carrying, the Asimovian protagonist, the future builder of civilizationally important things, the boy who had read the complete encyclopedia and programmed a video game at 12, and drawn from the Haldeman family mythology the conviction that he was not an ordinary person moving through an ordinary life, and the daily reality of being a person who was cleaning industrial boilers for $18 an hour because that was the work available. This conflict between self-conception and present circumstance is one that every ambitious young person who has not yet converted their ambition into external validation must navigate. And the navigation is genuinely difficult, because the self-conception is not, at this stage, supported by evidence visible to anyone other than the person carrying it. You are not yet what you believe you will be. You are currently what the circumstances have made you, which is a person in a boiler suit, and the distance between these two identities must be bridged by something. Faith, stubbornness, the systematic daily decision to treat the current circumstance as temporary rather than definitive, that is not available for external inspection and cannot be borrowed from others. Elon bridged it with a cognitive move that has characterized his approach to adversity throughout his adult life, the radical reframing of present difficulty as data rather than obstacle. The boiler was not a humiliation. It was information. Specific, embodied, irreplaceable information about what industrial systems actually looked like from the inside, what they required to function, what happened when maintenance was deferred, what the relationship was between the abstract engineering specifications of a system and the physical reality of a human being required to interact with that system in conditions the engineering specifications had not optimized for human comfort. He had spent his South African years building mental models of how things worked from books and manuals and the encyclopedias that he had consumed with the hunger of someone who knows that models are the instrument and is determined to build the best ones available. The boiler was something different, a correction to those models, a calibration, the point at which abstract understanding of industrial systems made contact with the specific texture of what industrial systems actually smell like and feel like and cost the person inside them. He moved, in the months following the boiler episode, through a series of other manual labor positions that provided similar calibrations. The farm work in Saskatchewan, on the land of the relative who had provided the initial destination, the phone number in the backpack, was physical in the way that agricultural labor in the Canadian prairies in the late 1980s was physical, large-scale, machine-assisted but not yet fully automated, organized around the pace of natural systems that did not adjust to the worker's schedule. Elon worked in the heat and the flatness, accumulating the specific kind of knowledge that can only be accumulated through extended physical engagement with the systems in question. The knowledge that engineers who have only ever encountered farming as an abstraction, as an input-output system in a supply chain model, do not possess, and that tends to produce, when it is absent, engineering solutions to farming problems that are technically elegant and practically useless. The revealing action of this chapter is not a single episode but a pattern of decision-making that is visible across the sequence of jobs Elon took in his Canadian interval, and that constitutes, in retrospect, the clearest available evidence of the cognitive orientation that would eventually make him a different kind of entrepreneur than most of the people he would later compete and collaborate with. He consistently chose the harder option, when the harder option offered superior information. Not the higher-paying option, not the more prestigious option, not the more comfortable option. The option that would teach him something about physical reality that he did not yet know and could not learn any other way. The boiler over the office job. The farm over the retail position. The lumber mill's physical infrastructure over the administrative work that would have been easier to obtain with his educational credentials. He was building a model of physical reality from the inside out, accumulating the kind of first principles understanding of how things are actually made and maintained and operated that the Pretoria years, for all their technical richness, could not have provided, because the Pretoria years had not required him to be the person doing the making and maintaining and operating with his own hands. This is the insight that most accounts of Musk's management style have described without fully explaining. His tendency to know, with a specificity that surprises and occasionally unnerves his engineers, exactly what a given manufacturing process actually requires in terms of time and materials and physical effort. He is not, when he challenges production timelines, simply being difficult. He is drawing on a model of physical reality that was built in part in the specific conditions of a Saskatchewan boiler and a prairie farm in the summer of 1989, by a 17-year-old who had decided, without being fully conscious of the decision, to treat every environment he was placed in as a graduate seminar in what the world was actually made of. The figure who was most significant in this period, and whose significance has been underweighted in most accounts of Musk's Canadian chapter, is not a mentor or a collaborator or a romantic partner, but an absence, specifically the absence of Kimball, who had not yet followed Elon to Canada, and whose presence in Pretoria, maintaining the sibling bond across the distance, constituted the primary human connection that Elon was carrying through the boiler work and the farm labor and the isolation of a young man in a new country without an established social context. The phone calls between the brothers in this period have not been documented in any public record, but their functional significance is not difficult to infer. Kimball was the person to whom Elon was reporting, the audience for the ongoing narration of the Canadian experience, the person whose understanding of where Elon had come from and where he was going gave the current circumstances their context and therefore their meaning. Without Kimball, the boiler was just a boiler. With Kimball, even at the distance of a transatlantic phone call, even present only as a voice that knew the South African backstory and could therefore correctly interpret the Canadian foreground, the boiler was a chapter in a story that both brothers understood themselves to be inside. When Kimball arrived in Canada, following Elon by approximately a year, and with the same combination of Canadian citizenship and departure from South Africa motivation, the dynamic shifted from long-distance narration to direct collaboration. The brothers, together in the North American context for the first time, immediately began the mutual calibration process that their Pretoria years had established as their default mode of engagement. Elon providing the analytical framework, the systems-level assessment of what the environment made possible. Kimball providing the social intelligence, the ability to read the human landscape of the new country in ways that Elon's operating system did not natively support. They were, together, more capable than either was separately, and both of them knew it, and the knowledge produced in both of them a specific kind of confidence, not the unfounded confidence of people who have not yet been tested, but the tested confidence of people who have assessed their own capabilities accurately and found them, in combination, adequate to something significantly larger than a Saskatchewan boiler. Queen's University, when Elon enrolled, provided the institutional structure that the Canadian interval had lacked, and that the next stage of the plan required. It also provided, for the first time since his South African schooling, a peer environment in which intellectual seriousness was not a social liability, in which the question of whether you had read the complete encyclopedia was interesting rather than alarming, in which the intensity of engagement with ideas that had made Elon a target in Pretoria's school hallways was, at minimum, not actively punished. He was not, at Queen's, suddenly and completely at home in a social sense. The social fluency that the Bryanston years had failed to develop did not appear fully formed in Kingston, Ontario. But the hostility was gone, and the absence of hostility was, for someone who had spent the preceding decade navigating environments organized around punishing him for being what he was, something very close to peace. What was not peaceful, And what the Canadian interval had done nothing to reduce was the urgency. The specific Asimovian urgency of a person who believes that there is important work to be done, and that every month spent not doing it is a month of civilizational consequence unnecessarily deferred. Queens was a waypoint, and Elon treated it with the respect appropriate to a waypoint, seriously, competently, without the investment of energy that a destination would have warranted, while keeping the actual destination locked in the navigational system, with the constancy of someone who has not, for a single day of the boiler cleaning or the farm work or the Kingston campus life, forgotten where he is actually going and why, and who has understood from the Saskatchewan summer onward that the floor is always closer than you think and that the only reliable protection against it is to build with whatever materials the current environment provides, something strong enough to stand on when the floor arrives. What the floor would feel like in the specific conditions of Silicon Valley, where the materials were venture capital, and engineering talent, and a market that did not yet know what it wanted, but was about to discover it with a velocity that would make everything Elon had experienced in Saskatchewan look like a very gentle form of difficulty. This was the education that Canada, for all its utility as a waypoint and a calibration, could not provide, and that only the destination itself, approached now with the credentials and the plan and the hardened, labor-tested, boiler-clean certainty of someone who has crossed the floor and knows what crossing feels like, could begin to deliver. Chapter 12. Queen's University. Intellectual Awakening in Kingston. The conversation had been running for 3 hours, which was not unusual. What was unusual, for the person on the other side of it, was the quality of attention it required, the sense that the questions being asked were not the conversational questions that people ask to fill space or demonstrate interest but genuine interrogations, the questions of someone who needed the answer because the answer was a missing variable in a model he was actually building and intended to actually use. The student across the table, Elon Musk, 18 years old, in the first year of his enrollment at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, had initiated the conversation by cold calling a business executive whose name he had encountered in a newspaper, explaining that he was a student interested in learning how the person's industry actually worked, and asking if they would be willing to talk. The executive had agreed, with the mildly bemused assent of someone who is not accustomed to being called directly by undergraduates, and finds the directness interesting enough to reward. 3 hours later, the executive had answered questions that ranged across the technical infrastructure of the industry, its competitive dynamics, its regulatory environment, its capital requirements, its failure modes, and its relationship to the adjacent industries that constrained and enabled it. And Elon had not taken notes because he did not need to take notes, because the model was being constructed in real time in a mind that retained information with the fidelity of a system designed specifically for that purpose. This was the method. Not a method he had read about or been taught, a method he had arrived at independently, through the simple logic of identifying the most efficient route between the information he needed and the source of that information, and executing on that route with the social fearlessness of someone who has been rejected by peer groups sufficiently often that the possibility of rejection by a stranger no longer registers as a meaningful deterrent. He called executives. He called professors at other universities whose published research intersected with questions he was working through. He called the authors of books he had read and disagreed with in specific and articulable ways. The calls were almost always taken because the quality of the questions and the preparation evident in the asking of them communicated something that busy and accomplished people respond to with reliable consistency, the sense that the person on the other end of the line is serious in a way that makes the expenditure of time feel like an investment rather than a charity. Kingston, Ontario, in 1990 was a mid-sized Canadian city organized around two institutions, Queen's University and the Canadian Forces Base that shared the city's geography. And the academic culture that the university generated had a specific character that mattered for understanding why Queen's, rather than a more obviously prestigious institution, served as the context for Elon's intellectual awakening in North America. Queen's had, and has, a reputation for a particular kind of serious, somewhat self-contained academic culture. A culture that took ideas seriously without the self-congratulatory quality that sometimes characterizes more famous institutions, that rewarded genuine intellectual engagement without requiring it to perform in the specific registers of Ivy League ambition. For a student who had spent his South African educational years in environments that punished intellectual seriousness, and his Canadian interval in environments that had no particular relationship with intellectual life at all, Queen's offered something that he had not previously had consistent access to: a community of peers for whom the quality of thinking was a primary value rather than a social liability. The world outside Kingston's campus in 1990 was in the early stages of a transformation that Elon was, with the pattern recognition capabilities of someone who had been reading technology history since childhood, beginning to see with a clarity that most of his contemporaries did not yet share. The Cold War was ending. The Berlin Wall had fallen in November of the previous year, and the Soviet Union was in the accelerating process of dissolution that would complete itself the following year. And the end of the Cold War was doing something to the global imagination that was difficult to name precisely but impossible to miss if you were paying attention. It was releasing a set of energies and ambitions that the ideological confrontation of the preceding 4 decades had absorbed and constrained. The question of what civilization was for, which the Cold War had answered with the binary clarity of competing totalisms, was suddenly open again, genuinely open, available for the first time in a generation to answers that were not organized around the confrontation between capitalism and communism, but around the question of what human beings could build when the confrontation was no longer the organizing framework of political and economic life. Elon was paying attention. He was also, in the specific environment of Queens in the early 1990s, encountering for the first time the infrastructure of a communications technology that would, within the decade, reorganize the conditions of information access and commercial exchange more thoroughly than any development since the printing press. The Internet existed in 1990 as an academic and military network, not yet commercialized, not yet accessible to the general public in the form that would make it the defining infrastructure of late 20th and early 21st century life, but present in the university environment in its early form, available to students who were curious enough to find it and technically sophisticated enough to use it. Elon was both. He encountered the early Internet with the recognition of someone who has been waiting for a specific tool without knowing precisely what it would look like, and who, upon seeing it, understands immediately what it is and what it is for. The core conflict of this chapter is not the conflict between Elon and an external obstacle. The external obstacles of the Canadian interval had been resolved, but the internal conflict between the breadth of what he wanted to understand and the narrowness of what any single academic program could provide. Queen's offered him a business program that was serious and rigorous and provided genuine formation in the analytical frameworks of economics and management. It did not offer him physics at the level he needed, or engineering at the depth he intended, or the specific combination of disciplines that his developing framework for thinking about the future required. He was building, across the Queen's years, what he would later articulate as the 3 pillars: the Internet, sustainable energy, multiplanetary life, not as a formal intellectual project with a name and a methodology, but as a gradually clarifying intuition about which problems were most important and which technological developments were most likely to determine the trajectory of human civilization over the coming century. The intuition required inputs from physics and economics and engineering and biology and political philosophy and a dozen other domains. And the university curriculum, however well designed for its stated purposes, was not designed to supply all of them. He solved this conflict the way he solved most resource constraints: by supplementing the formal supply with informal acquisition conducted with the systematic efficiency of someone who has identified the gap between what the institution provides and what the problem requires and has decided to fill it personally. He read outside the curriculum with the same totality he had brought to the Encyclopedia and Pretoria, not sampling, not browsing, but building complete models, working through a domain from its foundational principles to its current frontier, assessing where the existing understanding was adequate and where it was not, and what the inadequacy implied for the problems he was trying to think through. The Queen's Library was a resource he used with a frequency and a depth that the librarians noticed and later remembered. He was not the student who consulted the library for assigned readings. He was the student who was working his way through the library. The revealing action of this chapter is a series of conversations, the cold calls to executives, yes, but also the conversations within the Queen's community that began to establish Elon as a specific kind of intellectual presence, the kind that generates a slightly unusual experience in the people who encounter it. A fellow student at Queen's, reflecting on conversations with Elon during this period, described the experience with a precision that has the quality of genuine memory rather than retrospective mythology. Talking to him about a topic he had thought about was like consulting a reference work that had opinions. The factual density was extraordinary. The recall of specific data, the ability to cite the relevant study or the relevant historical precedent or the relevant engineering constraint with an accuracy that could be verified. But the facts were not inert. They were organized, embedded in a framework that had a direction that was building toward a conclusion, and the conclusion was always, in some form, a proposition about what should be built and why and by whom. He was not, in these conversations, performing expertise. He was thinking out loud, and the thinking out loud had a destination. The destination, in the Queen's years, was beginning to resolve from the general Asimovian framework. Preserve the light of consciousness, ensure human civilization survives its own tendencies, into something more specific and more operational. The Internet was one pillar. A technology that would, he was increasingly certain, reorganize the conditions of information access and commercial exchange in ways that most existing businesses had not begun to anticipate, and that would therefore create a window of opportunity for people who saw the reorganization coming to build the infrastructure of the new commercial landscape before the established players understood what was being built. Sustainable energy was a second pillar, a necessity rather than a preference. The physical reality of fossil fuel finitude and atmospheric carbon accumulation, demanding an engineering response that was both technically solvable and commercially unaddressed. The gap between what existed and what was required, representing an opportunity of exactly the scale that justified the attention of someone oriented towards civilizationally important problems. And multi-planetary life was the third and most audacious pillar. The recognition, absorbed from Asimov and from his own reading of the paleontological and astronomical literature on extinction events, that a species confined to a single planet is a species with a single point of failure, and that the correction of this architectural flaw was not a luxury for a wealthy civilization, but a prerequisite for the civilization's long-term survival. Justine Wilson appeared in this landscape with the specific timing of a person who arrives at exactly the moment when the landscape is capable of including her. They met at Queen's. The precise circumstances of the first meeting have been described in Justine's own memoir with the candor and the literary intelligence of a writer who has processed the experience thoroughly and arrived at a clear-eyed account of it. And the dynamic that established itself between them had from the beginning the quality of a genuine intellectual engagement complicated by the specific asymmetries of Elon's relational style. He was interested in her, genuinely and persistently. The pursuit she has described was real, sustained across the early resistances with the systematic determination he brought to every problem he decided was worth solving. She was intelligent and literary, and possessed of a creative sensibility that was different from his own in ways that were complementary rather than merely compatible. Where he was analytic and model building, she was narrative and image making. And the difference was generative in the way that genuine intellectual differences between people who respect each other can be generative. What she also was, and what the Queen's chapter of her relationship with Elon established with a clarity that she has been honest about in her retrospective account, was the person who was falling behind in a race she had not fully understood she was entered in. Elon's capacity for total absorption in whatever problem he was working on, a capacity that was, in the Queen's years, directed partly toward her and partly toward the developing framework of his technological ambitions, would, as the ambitions grew and the problems became larger and the absorption became more total, progressively reorganize the relational dynamic in ways that the early romantic context had not predicted. This is a story that belongs to the chapters ahead. What belongs here is only the beginning of it. The Queen's campus, the conversations across dining hall tables, the first encounter between a woman of genuine intelligence and a man whose intelligence operated at a temperature that was exhilarating in proximity, and would prove at sustained proximity over many years to generate a heat that not every relationship could contain. By the time Elon transferred from Queen's to the University of Pennsylvania, a transfer accomplished characteristically with the systematic efficiency of someone who had identified the next required waypoint and executed the transition from the current one without unnecessary delay. The three pillars were not yet a public framework. They were a private organizing principle, the internal architecture of a mind that had spent the Queen's years building a model of which problems mattered most and which technologies were most likely to address them. The University of Pennsylvania's physics and economics programs would provide the next layer of formal foundation. Silicon Valley would provide the experimental field. But the Queen's years had provided something that neither Penn nor the Valley could have provided in the same way. The first environment in which Elon Musk had been free to think at full capacity, in full view of people who could follow him, without the social penalties that the Pretoria years had imposed, and without the physical demands that the Saskatchewan summer had imposed, and in that freedom he had built with the quiet efficiency of someone who understands that the most important construction is the one that happens before anyone is watching, the intellectual infrastructure that everything else would eventually be built upon. What he was carrying to Pennsylvania, and what Pennsylvania would test in ways that Queens had not quite prepared him for, was not merely a set of ideas about the internet and energy and space, but a self-conception that had now been validated, gently, by a supportive academic environment, by the phone calls that were returned, by the conversations that ran for 3 hours, by the first tentative evidence that the framework he had been building since he read Asimov at 9 years old was not a private mythology but a genuinely accurate model of what the future was going to require, and that self-conception, now carrying the weight of external confirmation for the first time, would prove to be both his greatest asset in the years ahead and the source of a rigidity, a difficulty in updating the model when the model was wrong, that the Pennsylvania years would begin to reveal with the slow patience of a stress test conducted at higher loads than the structure had previously encountered. Chapter 13. The transfer to Penn, Physics and Economics. The problem was written on the board in the particular handwriting of a physicist who has written the same equations so many times that the notation has become a kind of shorthand. The symbols compressed and confident in the way that expertise compresses everything it touches. It was a problem in thermodynamics, the branch of physics concerned with the relationships between heat and work, and the fundamental constraints that the universe imposes on any system that attempts to convert one into the other. The professor had presented it as a moderately difficult exercise for the third-week class, the kind of problem that sorted the students who had genuinely internalized the underlying principles from the students who had memorized the procedure without understanding why the procedure worked. Elon Musk, 20 years old and newly arrived at the University of Pennsylvania from Queens, sat in the middle section of the lecture hall and worked through the problem with the specific quality of focused stillness that his professors would come to recognize as his operating mode. Not the stillness of passivity, but the stillness of a processor running at full capacity, every available resource directed at the problem at hand, the external environment reduced to background noise. He arrived at the answer before the professor had finished explaining the approach, checked it twice using a different method, confirmed the agreement, and then did something that most students in the same position would not have done. He raised his hand and asked not whether his answer was correct, but whether there was a more computationally efficient path to the same result, because the approach suggested by the problem's framing seemed to introduce an unnecessary intermediate step. The professor paused. The question was, in the technical sense, correct. There was a more elegant route, one that the textbook did not present, because the textbook was organized around pedagogical accessibility rather than computational efficiency. The fact that a third-week undergraduate had identified the gap was noted. It was the kind of note that accumulates, in a university physics department, into a reputation. Philadelphia in 1992 was a city in the specific condition of post-industrial American urban centers at that moment in the country's economic history. The manufacturing base that had organized its working-class neighborhoods for much of the 20th century was largely gone. The service economy that would eventually replace it was still in the process of establishment, and the gap between these two economic formations was visible in the city's geography, in the neighborhoods adjacent to Penn's campus that the university's institutional resources had not reached, in the contrast between the carefully maintained Georgian architecture of the university itself and the surrounding blocks that told a different story about what the American economic transformation of the 1980s had distributed and to whom, and in the specific cultural atmosphere of a city that was home to one of the world's great research universities, and that had not yet fully worked out what the presence of that institution meant for the city beyond its immediate campus footprint. For Elon, arriving in Philadelphia with the Queen's transcript and the scholarship that had made the transfer financially possible, Penn represented something qualitatively different from Queen's, not better in every dimension, but operating at a different altitude. The University of Pennsylvania was an Ivy League institution with the specific institutional culture that the Ivy League generates, a combination of genuine intellectual seriousness and significant social stratification, a community that took ideas seriously while also taking the social hierarchy of its own membership more seriously than most of its members were fully conscious of. The Wharton School of Business, which Elon was entering alongside the physics program as the second half of his dual degree, was not merely a business school, but the business school, the institution that had trained more Fortune 500 executives than any other, that had established a specific grammar of finance and management that American corporate life had largely adopted as its native language, and that carried, in the specific ecosystem of American elite education, a weight and a prestige that opened doors before you knocked on them. Elon had not transferred to Penn for the door opening. He had transferred because Penn was where the specific combination of physics and economics could be pursued at the level he required, in an environment where the people teaching both disciplines were operating at the research frontier rather than the instructional baseline. The dual degree was not, for him, an exercise in credential accumulation. It was the recognition of a structural necessity in his developing framework for thinking about the three pillars. Physics set the constraints, what the laws of the universe would and would not permit, what the fundamental limits of any proposed technology were, what the engineering challenges of a given approach actually amounted to when you stripped away the commercial language and examined the underlying physical reality. Economics set the mechanisms, how capital moved through systems, what incentives drove behavior in markets, how the gap between a technically feasible solution and a commercially deployed one was bridged, and what the specific failures of market structure looked like that produced the underprovision of things the world needed, like sustainable energy infrastructure, like space launch capability, that private markets, left to their own logic, were not generating at adequate scale or speed. Together, the two disciplines gave him something that neither could have provided alone, a way of thinking about problems that began with physical reality and ended with economic mechanism, that could identify not merely what should be built, but why it hadn't been built yet, what the specific combination of technical difficulty and market failure and institutional inertia had produced the gap between the world as it was and the world as it should be. This was not, at Penn, a framework he articulated publicly or developed in conversation with professors who might have helped him refine it. It was a private intellectual construction, built in parallel with the formal coursework, visible primarily in the quality of the questions he asked and the specific angles from which he approached problems that the curriculum presented as settled. The core conflict of the Penn years was not academic. Elon handled the academic demands of a dual physics and economics degree with the efficiency of someone for whom the material, while genuinely difficult, was not operating at the ceiling of his capability. The conflict was more subtle and more important. It was the conflict between the intellectual framework he was building and the institutional frameworks that Penn, specifically Wharton, was designed to install. Wharton's pedagogical project was, in its most honest description, the transmission of a specific grammar of business thinking, a set of analytical frameworks, valuation methodologies, competitive strategy tools, and organizational behavior models that had been developed and refined across decades of business school scholarship, and that represented in aggregate the best available systematic understanding of how large commercial organizations operated and competed. This was genuinely valuable knowledge, and Elon acquired it with the same systematic thoroughness he brought to everything he studied. The conflict arose because Wharton's grammar, like all institutional grammars, embedded within it a set of assumptions about what was normal, what was feasible, what a reasonable business proposition looked like, and what an unreasonable one looked like, that were not derived from first principles, but from the accumulated experience of the industries and organizations that had shaped the curriculum. The industries that had shaped Wharton's curriculum were not the space launch industry, or the electric vehicle industry, or the solar energy industry. They were finance, consulting, consumer goods, established technology, the sectors that Wharton graduates reliably entered, and that therefore reliably funded the alumni networks and endowment contributions that maintained the school's institutional prestige. When Elon thought about rockets, Wharton's grammar had nothing to say. When he thought about electric vehicles, Wharton's grammar suggested, with the politely confident authority of an institution that had thought carefully about automotive industry economics, that the barriers to entry were prohibitive and the incumbent advantages were decisive. When he thought about solar energy, the grammar produced a similar assessment, organized around the current cost curves and the existing policy environment, and the conventional wisdom about what private capital could and could not accomplish in industries with long development timelines and significant technical risk. He listened to all of this. He absorbed it, assessed it, identified where it was accurate, and where it was importing assumptions that did not survive contact with first principles analysis. And he proceeded, in the privacy of his own thinking, to build the countercase for each of his three pillars, not out of contrarianism, not out of the adolescent need to be different that sometimes drives gifted students to reject institutional wisdom, but out of the genuine conviction that the institutional wisdom was working from incomplete models, that it was treating the current cost of battery technology or rocket manufacturing or solar panels as a fixed parameter rather than a variable that engineering effort could move, and that the failure to see this was producing systematic underinvestment in exactly the areas where the physical necessity was most urgent, and the economic opportunity was therefore most significant. The revealing action of this chapter is a paper, specifically a paper Elon wrote during his Penn years on the economics of solar energy and its potential for achieving grid-level cost competitiveness with fossil fuels. The paper was not a class assignment. It was a self-directed research project, the kind of work that someone does when they are using the university's resources to think through a problem that the university's curriculum has not quite gotten around to posing. The paper argued, from a careful analysis of the historical cost trajectories of photovoltaic technology and the manufacturing scale effects that drove those trajectories, that solar energy was not a marginal or niche energy source, but a technology on an exponential improvement curve that would, within a time horizon of decades, make it cost competitive with and ultimately cheaper than conventional fossil fuel generation. This was not, in 1992 and 1993, a mainstream view. The mainstream view, reflected in the energy economics literature of the period, treated solar as a premium technology appropriate for specialized applications, satellites, remote installations, demonstration projects, but not as a serious candidate for the base load generation that industrial economies required. Elon's paper disagreed, with the specific quality of disagreement that characterizes his best thinking. Not a rejection of the existing analysis, but an extension of it. A demonstration that the existing analysis had fixed a variable that was actually dynamic, and that allowing the variable to move, specifically allowing the manufacturing cost curve to continue its historical trajectory as production scale increased, produced conclusions that the existing analysis had not reached because it had not asked the question that the extended analysis required. The paper was not published. It was not, in the formal sense, an academic contribution that entered the literature and influenced subsequent research. But it was the first full articulation of an argument that Elon would spend the next 2 decades building the commercial infrastructure to prove, and the argument in its Penn-era form was already structurally sound in the ways that mattered. Navaid Farouk was, during the Penn years, the figure who served as both intellectual companion and social anchor for Elon in the specific environment of a large research university where the social landscape was complex, and the Wharton culture in particular rewarded a kind of gregarious networking fluency that was not Elon's natural mode of operation. Farouk was a fellow Penn student who combined genuine intellectual seriousness with social intelligence, someone who could navigate the Wharton culture without being entirely absorbed by it, and whose friendship with Elon had the quality of a genuine meeting of minds rather than the strategic relationship building that Wharton's culture encouraged. They shared a house off campus, and the domestic arrangement produced the kind of sustained intellectual exchange that formal academic contexts rarely generate. The long conversations that start as one thing and become another, that pursue a question past the point where the formal argument ends, and into the territory where the genuinely unresolved questions live. Farouk has described, In accounts given to journalists who have reported on Musk's Penn years, a specific quality of Elon's intellectual engagement during this period that illuminates something important about the dual-degree framework: the way Elon moved between the physics and the economics without the usual cognitive gear shifting that most people experience when they cross disciplinary boundaries. For most dual-degree students, the two programs were parallel tracks. You were a physics student on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and a Wharton student on Tuesday and Thursday, and the integration of the two frameworks was something you performed consciously, deliberately at the seams. For Elon, Farouk observed, the integration appeared to be continuous and automatic. Physics and economics were not two separate frameworks to be applied in sequence, but two aspects of a single framework that was always running, that processed every problem simultaneously through both lenses, that was always asking at once what the physical constraints were and what the economic mechanisms were, and where the gap between the two was largest and therefore most significant. The Penn years were, in retrospect, the period in which the Muskian methodology achieved its mature form. The first principles approach that he has described in interviews as his primary analytical tool, the practice of reducing a problem to its fundamental physical and economic realities before attempting to build a solution, rather than reasoning by analogy from existing solutions to adjacent problems, was not invented at Penn, but it was formalized there, given the disciplinary vocabulary and the mathematical infrastructure that transformed it from an intuitive tendency into a reproducible method. Physics gave him the language of constraints. Economics gave him the language of incentives. Together, they gave him a way of describing the gap between the world as it was and the world as it could be, that was specific enough to be actionable, specific enough, ultimately, to write a business plan around, to raise capital against, to recruit engineers toward, to stake the next decade of his life on. He left Penn, or more precisely, he left Penn for Stanford, and then left Stanford almost immediately for something else entirely, a decision whose logic was impeccable in Asimovian terms, and whose consequences no one around him fully anticipated, carrying the dual degree and the solar energy paper and the three-pillar framework, and the Farouk friendship and the Justine relationship and the specific confidence of someone who has spent 5 years in elite academic environments and found them, on balance, useful but insufficient, adequate preparation for the problem, but not the place where the problem could be solved. What was waiting in California, in the specific summer of 1995, was a window, a narrow, rapidly closing window, defined by the simultaneous maturation of internet infrastructure and the availability of venture capital to fund the commercial exploitation of that infrastructure. And Elon could see it with the clarity of someone who had spent 3 years at Wharton learning exactly how capital moved, and 3 years in Penn's physics department learning exactly what the physical infrastructure of a communications network actually was. And the seeing produced in him an urgency that 2 years of PhD study in Stanford's energy physics program, however intellectually rigorous, could not compete with. The PhD application had been accepted. The funding was in place. The academic path was open and well lit, and led by any conventional assessment of risk-adjusted outcomes to exactly the kind of credentialed expertise that would eventually support the ambitions he was carrying. He enrolled for 2 days before concluding, with the flat decisiveness of someone who has run the calculation and is not interested in running it again, that the window would not wait for a dissertation, and that the correct response to a closing window was not to study it but to go through it, and that the regret of having studied the window from the safe side of the frame was a cost he was not willing to pay, regardless of what the other costs turned out to be. Chapter 14. The Silicon Valley Summer, Early Networking. The commute alone was an education. Every morning that summer of 1994, Elon Musk folded his 6'1" frame into whatever transportation he could arrange and made his way south from the Bay Area toward Los Altos, where Pinnacle Research Institute occupied the kind of anonymous office park that .com mythology had not yet immortalized. The buildings were beige. The parking lots shimmered in the California heat. The work inside, however, was anything but ordinary. Pinnacle was developing ultracapacitors, energy storage devices that charged and discharged faster than conventional batteries. And to a young man who had grown up reading about rockets in his grandfather's encyclopedias and theorizing about physics in the fluorescent quiet of Queen's University, the technology felt like touching the seam where the possible and the impossible were still being negotiated. He was 23 years old. He did not know exactly how to dress for this kind of ambition. But he showed up. Those who encountered him at Pinnacle in those months would later describe a young man of unsettling intensity, someone who asked questions that seemed less like the questions of an intern and more like the questions of someone conducting a long-term audit of human knowledge. He was not rude about it. He was simply relentless, with a stillness in his gaze that made interlocutors feel they were being quietly catalogued. He wrote computer code when assigned. He read technical papers when not. When the office emptied in the late afternoons, he stayed. To understand what drove Elon Musk into those beige corridors requires understanding the particular electricity of Northern California in the early 1990s and the peculiar hunger of a man who had spent years simply trying to survive elsewhere. The decade had begun in anxiety. The dot-com wave had not yet crested. It was barely a wave at all, more of a tremor in the ground beneath Sand Hill Road, felt only by those who had pressed their ears to the earth. The Cold War had just ended, releasing a generation of engineers and scientists from the gravity of superpower competition, and they were floating, looking for new missions. The World Wide Web was still being poured into its first containers. Netscape would not go public until 1995. The venture capital ecosystem that would soon anoint a generation of founders operated with a clubbishness that made it legible only to those who already belonged, or who had the social ambition and geographic proximity to make themselves appear as if they did. Musk had none of the obvious credentials for membership. He was Canadian by recent acquisition, South African by birth, a graduate student at Queen's University in Ontario who had transferred to the University of Pennsylvania on the strength of his academic performance and the force of his own insistence. He was not from Stanford. He did not have a father who had seeded a fund or a professor who sat on a board. What he had was the knowledge that he wanted to be in this place, specifically, and not somewhere else. That certainty was its own form of capital, even if no one had yet agreed to value it. At Penn, where he was completing dual degrees in economics from the Wharton School and in physics from the College of Arts and Sciences, Musk had developed a framework for thinking about the world that was unusual for someone his age and unusual, frankly, for someone of any age. He believed, with a conviction that his professors sometimes found bracingly unfashionable, that the most important questions a person could ask were not about markets or materials in isolation, but about the intersection of the two. Physics told you what was possible. Economics told you what would get funded. If you understood both, you could draw a map from here to an alternate future. It was not, strictly speaking, the kind of interdisciplinary synergy that career counselors recommend. It was something more private and more operational than that. It was a method. He had begun sharing this method with anyone who would listen. During his Penn years, Musk and his friend Adio Rassi, with whom he co-rented a 10-bedroom house that they converted into a de facto nightclub on weekends to help cover the rent, talked obsessively about technology and its implications. The house parties were not merely social, they were, in Musk's framing, a kind of market research, a way of being inside the culture of young American aspiration. He was studying his adopted country the way a naturalist studies a new terrain, systematically, with both affection and distance. But Silicon Valley was not Penn, and the summer at Pinnacle introduced Musk to an obstacle that his intelligence alone could not resolve. The obstacle was relational. The world he was entering ran on networks, not merely on merit, and the networks were built on relationships that had been cultivated over years of dinners and referrals, and the particular mutual recognition that comes from having attended the same schools, worked under the same mentors, or navigated the same early failures together. Musk had not done any of these things with the people who mattered here. He was, in the essential social sense of Silicon Valley, a stranger. And strangers, however brilliant, did not get meetings with partners. They got assignments. The core tension of that summer was not technical. The ultracapacitor work was genuinely interesting to him, and he pursued it with his characteristic absorption. But Musk was also observing, with the analytical clarity that defined his self-education, that the technology itself was not the most valuable thing in the room. The most valuable thing in the room was the network that decided which technologies received resources and which did not. He could see that the relationship between a good idea and a funded idea was not direct. It was mediated by people who trusted each other. And he was not yet inside that circle of trust. What he did in response to this recognition was characteristically unsubtle. He began to engineer proximity. There is an anecdote from this period, recounted in the recollections of those who observed him, that functions as a kind of keyhole into the larger room of his character. Musk, during his time on the West Coast, made a habit of cold approaching people he wanted to learn from. He had done this before. In Pretoria, as a teenager, he had telephoned businessmen listed in the phone directory simply to ask them questions about their work, and remarkably, several had answered him. In California, the method was refined, but the impulse was identical. He would identify someone whose knowledge or access was relevant to his developing worldview, and he would find a way to be in conversation with them, whether through an introduction, a letter, or, when necessary, simple physical presence. He was not obsequious in these approaches. He was direct, even blunt, in a way that some found off-putting and others found clarifying. He wanted to know specific things. He asked about them. He listened to the answers with a concentration that was almost uncomfortable in its completeness. What this behavior revealed was not mere ambition, though ambition was certainly present. It revealed a particular theory of knowledge, that the most important things were not in books and papers alone, but also in the minds of people who had done things, and that access to those minds required active pursuit. He had learned, in Pretoria, and in Ontario, and now in California, that waiting to be invited was a strategy for people who had already arrived. He had not arrived. He therefore did not wait. It was during this summer that Musk's relationship with Adio Rassi, already foundational, took on a new dimension. Rassi was also orbiting the technology world, also trying to find his footing in an ecosystem that rewarded insiders. The two men had a quality in their friendship that was unusual. They were genuinely competitive with each other, in the way that close friends sometimes are, and this competition seems to have sharpened rather than diminished their respective drives. When Musk returned from California and talked about what he had seen, the capital sloshing toward internet infrastructure, the casual billions being imagined by people who were barely older than him, Rassi did not simply listen. He interrogated. He pushed back. He demanded precision in Musk's thinking. This quality of intellectual friction was something Musk would seek repeatedly in his relationships throughout his life, finding in certain friendships and partnerships a whetstone against which his ideas could be tested. Rassi provided that whetstone in these years, and the friendship became one of the few stable coordinates in a life that was otherwise in rapid, deliberate motion. They would remain close for decades, their bond formed in the particular crucible of shared ambition and mutual exposure to each other's unfiltered thinking. Years later, Musk would credit the formative quality of friendships forged in scarcity, in the years before the money, before the distance that success imposes between people, as among the most valuable things he carried into the future. The summer at Pinnacle ended. Musk returned to Penn to complete his degrees. He filed away what he had seen in California the way he filed away everything useful, not sentimentally but operationally, as data toward a decision that had not yet fully revealed itself. He knew, by the end of that summer, several things with a certainty he had not possessed before. He knew that the internet was not a niche but a substrate, a new infrastructure layer upon which an entire economy would be rebuilt, in the same way that electrification had rebuilt the economy of an earlier century. He knew that the venture capital ecosystem, for all its cliquishness, was not a closed system, but a system with exploitable entry points, and that the entry points were often created by people willing to ask questions that others found embarrassing in their directness. And he knew, in some quieter register of his self-understanding, that he was not going to stay in academia. He had enrolled in a doctoral program at Stanford. The acceptance letter would come. He would pack his bags. He would fly to California. And he would last in the program, approximately 2 days before the ground beneath Silicon Valley shook hard enough to pull him out of the classroom and into the street, where something vast and irreversible had already begun without him, and where the decision he made in that breathless early moment would set in motion consequences no one, not Rassi, not his professors, not the venture capitalists who had not yet agreed to take his calls, could have charted in advance. The ultracapacitors, he would later reflect, had taught him one thing above all others that summer, that energy stored is not the same as energy released, and that the distance between potential and action is not a technical problem but a problem of will, of timing, and of a certain willingness to accept that controlled explosions are still, by definition, explosions. He had been storing energy for years. He could feel, by the time he boarded that flight to California for the last time as a student, that the storage phase was nearing its end. What he could not yet feel, what no one in his orbit had yet thought to worry about, was the scale of the detonation that was coming, and who, in the blast radius of his acceleration, would be the first to get burned. Chapter 15. Stanford University, 2 days and a pivot. The office of the Graduate Admissions Coordinator in Stanford's Department of Materials Science and Engineering was exactly what it was supposed to be. That was the problem. The shelves held the right journals. The windows admitted the right quality of Northern California light, diffuse and golden, the kind of light that appeared in university brochures and seemed almost to have been engineered for the purpose of making serious intellectual work appear both important and serene. There were forms to be filled out, enrollment forms, housing forms, advisor assignment forms, and the forms were orderly. And the process by which a new doctoral student became a doctoral student was clear and well administered and had been followed by thousands of people before him, people who had gone on to publish papers and earn tenure and contribute incrementally to the aggregate forward motion of human knowledge. It was, in every measurable respect, a fine place to spend the next 4 to 6 years of a life. Elon Musk sat with this knowledge for approximately 48 hours. He had arrived in Palo Alto in the late summer of 1995 with everything he owned, which was not much, and with a plan, which was the Stanford PhD in Applied Physics and Materials Science, a logical extension of the dual degrees he had completed at Penn, and a credential that would theoretically grant him the standing to work at the frontier of energy storage technology. The plan had logic. His interest in ultracapacitors, sharpened during his internship at Pinnacle Research Institute the previous summer, fit neatly into the program's research agenda. He had been accepted. He had deferred other possibilities. He had, by every external measure, made a reasonable and prestigious decision. But in those first 2 days on campus, something kept pulling his attention away from the orientation materials and toward a different set of facts entirely, facts that had nothing to do with the orderly world of graduate seminars and faculty advisors, and everything to do with what was happening right now, a few miles away on Sand Hill Road, and in the converted garages and rented offices of a valley that was beginning, with a velocity that felt almost physical, to reshape itself around a technology that did not yet have a stable name. The Internet, in the summer of 1995, was not a metaphor or a prediction. It was a thing that was actually happening, and the people who understood this earliest were experiencing a particular species of vertigo, the sensation of watching a slow-motion avalanche from a position that was not, in fact, at a safe distance. Netscape had gone public on August 9, 1995, just weeks before Musk arrived in Palo Alto. The company had priced its shares at $28. They opened at $71. By the end of the day, they had reached nearly $75, giving a company that had never turned a profit a market capitalization that staggered the financial press and sent a signal through the technology world that registered less like a bell ringing and more like a starting gun firing. The browser wars were beginning. The race to colonize the Internet's commercial territory was underway. And Elon Musk, sitting in a graduate orientation session at one of the finest universities in the world, was watching it happen from the stands. The world into which he had inserted himself was one of extraordinary, almost hallucinatory possibility. Silicon Valley in 1995 was not the mature ecosystem it would later become, with its established playbooks and its organized hierarchies of angels and series rounds and acqui-hires. It was something raw and more genuinely chaotic, a place where people who had been, 6 months earlier, uncertain about their rent were suddenly fielding term sheets. Where a good idea, if you were in the right room with the right people at the right moment, could become a funded company inside of a week. The gatekeepers still existed, but they were beginning to lose their composure in the face of a technology that was moving faster than their frameworks for evaluating it. Musk had spent the previous year and a half studying these dynamics with the focused attention of someone preparing for an exam he had not yet been told he would take. At Penn, He had written papers on energy storage and the economics of electric vehicles. He had watched the Pinnacle internship carefully, not just for the technical knowledge, but for the intelligence it yielded about how capital decisions got made, how the distance between a technology and a product was navigated and by whom. He had developed, in conversation with Adio Resi and others, a map of the industries he believed were most ripe for transformation by the Internet. That list had 3 entries: content, financial services, and what he called, in his direct and unglamorous way, software for connecting people to information. He was not precious about the language. He was precise about the underlying logic. The hurdle he faced in those first 48 hours at Stanford was not external. It was not a hostile advisor, or an insufficiently stimulating curriculum, or a funding problem. It was entirely internal, and it was, at its core, a conflict between 2 legitimate versions of the future he might inhabit. In one version, he completed the degree. He spent 4 or 5 years becoming the world's foremost expert on a specific and genuinely important technology. He published. He built credibility within a system that knew how to evaluate and reward that kind of credibility. He emerged on the other side with a credential that would give him standing in any room he entered, and he used that standing to pursue the large ideas he had been carrying since adolescence. In the other version, he left now. He left, and he competed for territory that was being claimed in real time by people who were not waiting. He traded the credential for the moment, the long game of institutional legitimacy for the short window of first-mover advantage, and he accepted that if he was wrong about the timing, if the Internet's commercial phase was less immediate than he believed, or if the competition for that territory was less permeable to a 24-year-old without venture connections than he hoped, there would be no safety net, no advisor's letter of recommendation, no degree to fall back on. He would simply be another person who had walked away from Stanford, which is a very different thing from being a Stanford graduate. He left after 2 days. The decision was reached not in a meeting with his faculty advisor, or in a long conversation with Resi or with his brother Kimball, who had followed him to North America, and whose presence in his life during this period was both practical and emotionally anchoring. It was reached by all available evidence, in the private interior where Musk has always made his most consequential choices, quickly, with the appearance of certainty, and with a completeness that left little visible room for the ambivalence that surely existed somewhere beneath the surface. He went to the relevant office. He completed the relevant paperwork. He walked out of Stanford a student no longer. The keyhole into his character in this moment is not the decision itself. Others have left doctoral programs, and the mythology of the dropout founder had not yet been fully assembled, so he was not performing a script that had been written for him. The keyhole is the reasoning he offered afterward, in the years when he was occasionally asked to reconstruct those 48 hours. "I could always come back if it didn't work out," he said in various formulations to various interlocutors. It is a sentence worth examining with some care, because it does not quite describe the psychology it claims to describe. The statement presents the decision as reversible, as a pragmatic calculation about expected values and risk-adjusted returns. But the underlying logic of his subsequent behavior, the totality with which he committed to what came next, the absence of any visible looking back, suggests that the reversibility was a framing device, a way of making the decision legible to people who needed it to be legible, rather than an accurate description of how he experienced it. He did not leave Stanford planning to return. He left Stanford the way he left things, completely and without visible mourning. What he did in the immediate aftermath was call his brother. Kimball Musk had followed Elon from Canada to the United States with the particular combination of loyalty and independent ambition that characterized their relationship. The 2 brothers were not mirror images. Kimball was warmer in his public presentation, more socially fluent in ways that would eventually lead him toward the restaurant industry and agricultural technology, more interested in the human textures of business rather than its engineering substrate. But they shared a quality of thinking that made them effective partners in the early years, a willingness to take the logic of an idea seriously, to follow it past the point where most people stopped, past the point of comfort and into the territory where the idea either held or it didn't. When Elon called and told him what he had done, Kimball did not argue. He asked what came next. What came next was Zip 2. But the shape of Zip 2, what it would be, what it would demand, what it would reveal about the difference between having good ideas and being capable of executing them under conditions of genuine scarcity, was not yet visible from the vantage point of that phone call. What was visible was simpler and also more frightening. Elon Musk was now in California, without a university affiliation, without a salary, without a significant network of people who had agreed to bet on him, and without the particular insulation that comes from being enrolled in a prestigious program whose prestige reflects, however dimly and derivatively, onto its members. He was 24 years old. He had, more or less, nothing except the ideas, the physics, the economics, and the absolute refusal to behave as though any of this constituted a problem he could not solve. The Netscape IPO had shown him the size of the wave. The Stanford withdrawal had shown him something about himself. What he could not yet see, and what the coming months would teach him in the specific and unsparing way that only execution teaches, was that the gap between understanding a wave and surfing one is not a matter of knowledge. It is a matter of what you are willing to do in the moment when the water rises faster than you expected, and the board feels less stable than it looked from the shore, and the people on the beach are watching to see whether you will ride it or be buried by it. He had walked away from the safety of the shore. The wave was already moving. Kimball would be there when it hit, and the early months of building what would become Zip 2, the arguments with investors who did not return calls, the code written in a rented office that doubled as a sleeping space, the negotiations with newspaper companies that did not understand what he was selling because the thing he was selling had not yet demonstrated that it was worth buying, would test not just Elon's intelligence or his work capacity, but something more fundamental about his character, his ability to sustain belief in a vision during the extended and unglamorous interval between the moment of commitment and the moment of vindication. That interval, it would turn out, was longer and more punishing than either brother had accounted for, and the pressure it generated would surface qualities in Elon Musk, his relentlessness, yes, but also his impatience, his difficulty accepting that other people moved through the world at a different speed than he did, and his tendency to burn at a temperature that lit up everything around him and left little room for anything to survive that was not also burning, that would define every room he entered for the rest of his life. The Stanford acceptance letter was still in his bag, technically, folded or unfolded, read once or twice, and then set aside, the way you set aside a door you have already decided not to walk through. Somewhere in Palo Alto, a faculty advisor was looking at an empty chair and wondering what had happened to the new student who had seemed so promising on paper. Then somewhere a few miles away, in the particular low light of a California evening that made even parking lots look like the opening frames of something significant, a 24-year-old with no office and no funding and no roadmap except the one he was drawing as he moved forward was beginning to understand, in a way that would only become clear in retrospect, that he had just made the most important decision of his life, and that the consequences of that decision, good and catastrophic alike, were only now, in this quiet and unwitnessed moment, beginning their long approach. Chapter 16. The Palo Alto scrapper, living in the office. The alarm did not wake him, because there was no alarm. There was only the particular quality of California morning light finding its way through the office blinds at an angle that changed by small degrees each day as the summer of 1995 gave way to autumn, and the sound of Palo Alto beginning its business outside the window, cars on the boulevard, a delivery truck, the ambient acoustic texture of a city that did not know and would not have cared that the young man inside was sleeping on the floor. The sleeping bag was compact. The office was roughly 400 square feet. The rent was $400 a month, which represented a calculation as much as a compromise. $400 for the office meant that neither Elon nor Kimball Musk needed to pay rent anywhere else, because the office was also, for the foreseeable future, home. Elon would rise from the floor, change his clothes from the small supply he maintained in the corner, and walk to the YMCA on Embarcadero Road, where for the cost of a membership he could shower and return to the office by the time the rest of Palo Alto had finished its first cup of coffee. There was a logic to the arrangement that appealed to something fundamental in him, not the asceticism itself, which was never the point, but the efficiency of it, the way it compressed the distance between where he was and where he needed to be by eliminating every unnecessary variable. Rent was a variable. Commuting was a variable. The entire domestic infrastructure of a conventional life was a variable, and variables consumed time, and time was the only resource in genuine scarcity. Money could be raised. Knowledge could be acquired. Time moved in one direction only, and the internet, he was increasingly certain, was not going to pause to allow him to locate a furnished apartment. He would be back at his desk before 9. He would still be at his desk most nights past midnight. In the hours between, he would write code. The company he and Kimball were building had emerged from a specific observation about the mismatch between what newspapers possessed and what the internet was beginning to demand. Local businesses needed to be findable. Local newspapers had the relationships with those businesses, the advertising accounts, the listings, the institutional knowledge of the commercial geography of their cities, but they lacked the technological infrastructure to make that knowledge useful in a digital environment. Zip2, as the company would come to be named, would build that infrastructure and license it to the papers, who would pay for the ability to offer their advertisers something that their advertisers were going to want, whether or not the papers were ready to provide it. It was not a complicated idea. Its execution, however, was. The America that Elon Musk was attempting to sell in the autumn and winter of 1995 was a country that was, in its dominant economic and cultural institutions, genuinely uncertain about what the internet was. This is difficult to reconstruct with accuracy from the vantage point of a world in which connectivity is so total and so normalized that its absence is experienced as deprivation. But the uncertainty was real and consequential. The newspaper industry, in particular, occupied a position of strange double exposure in this moment. It could see, if it chose to look, the outline of the force that would eventually dismantle its business model. But the dismantling had not yet begun in earnest, and the instinct of large institutions confronted with nascent disruption is almost always to find reasons why the disruption does not apply to them or will not arrive on the schedule that the disruptors are advertising. The newspaper executives whom Musk was attempting to contact in these months were not stupid. They were, in many cases, intelligent and experienced people who had built and maintained successful enterprises. They simply did not return his calls. This was the external dimension of the obstacle. The internal dimension was more complex and ultimately more revealing. Elon Musk had a theory. He had, in fact, several theories, and they were good theories, grounded in a reading of economic incentives and technological trajectories that would prove with time to be largely correct. But a theory, however correct, is not a company. A company requires other people to believe in it, and the specific challenge of those early months in the Palo Alto office was not the coding which he could control, and not the logic which he found self-evident, but the persuasion. The grinding, humbling, repeatedly unsuccessful project of convincing people who had no reason to trust him that he was worth trusting. He was 24 years old. He had no track record. He had no Stanford degree, because he had withdrawn after 2 days. He had no network of warm introductions, no former employer who would vouch for him, no investor who had made money alongside him in a previous venture and could credibly tell another investor that this young man was the real thing. He had Kimball, who was working alongside him with an energy that matched his own but that was differently oriented, warmer in the room, better at reading the social temperature of a meeting, able to deploy a charm that Elon neither possessed nor particularly wished to possess. And he had the idea, and the code he was writing to instantiate it, and the absolute certainty that he was correct about the direction things were moving. Certainty without credibility is a very specific kind of loneliness. The anecdote that functions as a keyhole into his character during these months is not dramatic in its external presentation. It concerns a decision about the codebase. In the early weeks of Zip2's existence, Musk was writing essentially all of the company's software himself, the mapping systems, the business directory functionality, the interface through which users would eventually navigate local commercial information. He was not a trained software engineer in the formal sense. His coding had been largely self-taught, beginning with the Commodore VIC-20 in Pretoria and continuing through his years at Queen's and Penn, where he had written code as an instrument rather than as a discipline. What he lacked in formal methodology, he compensated for in speed and in a willingness to work through problems at an intensity that most trained engineers, operating in normal workplace conditions, would not have sustained. At some point in this period, a more experienced engineer looked at his code and delivered an assessment that was not unkind but was direct. The architecture had problems. It would work for now, but it would not scale. If the company grew, if the number of users and newspaper clients expanded to the point where growth itself became a technical challenge, the foundations Musk had built would require significant reconstruction. This is not an unusual situation in early-stage startups. The pressure to build something that works today frequently conflicts with the engineering discipline required to build something that will continue to work tomorrow. The usual response among founders who take the feedback seriously involves some combination of humility and recalibration. Musk listened to the assessment. He did not dispute it exactly. He disputed the prioritization. The code worked now. Now was what mattered. He would rebuild what needed to be rebuilt when the growth arrived that would require the rebuilding, and not a moment before, because the moment before was occupied by the more urgent problem of getting any growth at all. He was right about this, in a narrow and tactical sense. He was also wrong about it, in a way that would eventually require exactly the kind of expensive reconstruction that had been predicted. And that would be carried out not by him, but by the professional engineering team brought in later, after the venture capital arrived, and with it the professionals who would take his company and reshape it in ways that would teach him his most painful early lessons about the relationship between a founder and the institution his founding creates. But that reckoning was still ahead. In the winter of 1995, in the 400-square-foot office, the code ran, and that was enough. Kimball was the gravitational counterweight of these months, in ways that are sometimes obscured by the subsequent magnitude of Elon's trajectory. The brothers' dynamic in this period was not one of equals in a conventional sense. Elon was writing the technology that the business depended upon, which gave him a foundational position that was not easily challenged, but Kimball brought something that the enterprise genuinely required, and that Elon, operating alone, would have been slower to develop: the capacity to be in a room with a skeptical stranger and make that stranger feel that the product being described was not merely logical but desirable. He translated. He warmed. He sat across from newspaper executives who were not going to return Elon's calls, and he made them feel understood, and then made them feel curious, and sometimes eventually made them feel that saying yes was their own idea. The brothers had always operated, even in childhood in Pretoria, with a quality of mutual reliance that was different from ordinary sibling closeness. They had grown up in a household that required resilience, and the resilience had been partly individual and partly collective, and the habit of collectivity had persisted through the move to Canada, through the years at Queen's, through the navigation of an unfamiliar country, and an unfamiliar culture, and an economy that did not immediately present obvious entry points to two young men with foreign accents and ambitious ideas. Kimball's decision to follow Elon to California, and to put his own years into Zip2 was not a small sacrifice. It was an act of faith in his brother that was not naive. Kimball was not a naive person, but was wholehearted in a way that defined the early company as something different from a purely transactional partnership. There were tensions, as there always are between people living and working in close proximity under conditions of scarcity and stress. Elon's operating mode, the long nights, the code-first orientation, the tendency to treat interpersonal friction as an inefficiency to be minimized rather than a signal to be read, did not always map neatly onto the requirements of a business that needed, at various moments, more than code. Kimball would push back. The pushback did not always land. Elon's confidence in his own judgment, already notable at 24, was not the kind of confidence that softened easily under pressure. And the small office, with its sleeping bags and its startup-issue tension, was not an environment that created natural space for the unhurried working through of disagreement. But they held. They held because the alternative was worse, and because what they were building was, in those moments when the loneliness and the exhaustion and the unanswered phone calls and the slowly mounting credit card debt receded far enough to allow the original vision back into focus, genuinely exciting. The internet was real. The need was real. The technology worked. These were not small things to hold on to, in a 400-square-foot room at midnight. The mythology of those months, the YMCA showers, the sleeping bags, the code written in the dark while the rest of Palo Alto slept, has been told often enough that it has acquired the smooth, simplified surface of a founding legend, all the rough edges worn away by repetition, until what remains is an image of monastic discipline and visionary sacrifice. The image is not false. But it is incomplete in the way that all founding legends are incomplete, which is to say it omits the texture of the doubt, the specific weight of a phone that has not rung, the experience of walking to the YMCA in the gray California morning and standing under the shower with the knowledge that you have at this exact moment given up the credential and the salary and the conventional safety net and have received in exchange, so far, nothing but your own certainty that you are right. The certainty held. The company slowly began to move. The first newspaper clients came. The code ran on servers that were, by the standards of what was coming, laughably modest. The venture capital world was still largely unaware that Zip2 existed, which was a problem that would soon demand a solution of its own, and the solution would arrive, as solutions in this world tended to arrive, carrying in one hand the money that was needed, and in the other hand a set of conditions and a set of people who would change everything about the company that Elon Musk believed he was building, in ways he had not anticipated and could not from the floor of the Palo Alto office have been expected to see coming. The sleeping bag stayed in the corner through the winter. Outside, on University Avenue and Sand Hill Road, and in the offices of venture firms that had not yet agreed to take a meeting, the ecosystem that would decide Zip2's fate was conducting its own calculations, and the terms it was preparing to offer a 24-year-old founder sleeping on the floor of his own company would arrive sooner than he expected, wrapped in the language of partnership, carrying the quiet and entirely unannounced intention of teaching him, in the most direct and unsparing way available, exactly how much of his company he actually controlled. Chapter 17. First Principles Development, the Physics of Business. The question arrived in the middle of a conversation that was going nowhere. It was the kind of meeting that Elon Musk was having with some regularity in late 1995 and into 1996. A meeting with someone who knew the industry, who had been in the industry for longer than Musk had been paying attention to it, and who was explaining, with the patient authority of accumulated experience, why the thing Musk was proposing was more difficult than Musk appeared to understand. The specific subject of the meeting is less important than its structure, because the structure was consistent. An expert would describe the constraints of the existing system, the reasons certain costs were fixed and certain timelines were immovable, and certain established methods were established because they had survived contact with reality in ways that newer methods had not yet been tested against. And Musk would listen, in that way he had of listening that was not quite polite and not quite impolite, and at some point in the recitation of constraints he would stop the conversation with a question that the expert had not been asked before or had not been asked in quite that way. And the question would be some version of the same question he had been asking, in different forms, since he was a child in Pretoria reading encyclopedias in the afternoon light. But why? Not why in the rhetorical sense, the way a frustrated person asks why when they mean this is unreasonable. Why in the Socratic sense? Why in the scientific sense? Why as a genuine demand for the load-bearing structure beneath the claim? Why as an insistence that the expert distinguish between what was physically true and what was conventionally assumed, between what the laws of nature actually prohibited and what the habits of an industry had merely made expensive or inconvenient or unfashionable to attempt? The question, asked with sufficient precision and sufficient persistence, had a tendency to make experts uncomfortable in a way that they sometimes experienced as rudeness and that Musk experienced as method. He had been developing this method for years, though he had not yet given it the name by which it would eventually become famous. First principles thinking, the practice of decomposing any problem into its most fundamental physical or logical components, and reasoning upward from those components rather than from the accumulated conventions that industry and history had deposited on top of them, was not, in the abstract, a novel philosophical approach. Aristotle had described something like it. Descartes had practiced something like it. Physicists operated by something like it, as a matter of professional necessity, since physics is precisely the discipline of asking what the universe actually does rather than what observers have historically expected it to do. What was unusual about Musk was not that he knew about first principles, but that he applied them outside the domain in which they were conventionally employed, that he brought the physicist's epistemological discipline to bear on problems that were customarily approached through the lens of business convention, industry precedent, and received wisdom, and that he did so with a literalness and a consistency that most people, even people who considered themselves rigorous thinkers, did not sustain under the pressure of other people's expertise. The mid-1990s were a peculiar moment for this kind of thinking. The technology industry was in the early stages of a cultural formation that would eventually produce its own orthodoxies, its own received wisdoms, its own accumulated conventions that a later generation of disruptors would need to interrogate with the same first principles discipline that Musk was now applying to the orthodoxies of older industries. But in 1995 and 1996, the orthodoxies of the technology industry had not yet fully hardened. The field was young enough that its founding assumptions were still somewhat visible as assumptions rather than as facts. This gave people operating at its frontier, and particularly people who were simultaneously drawing on frameworks from outside the industry, an unusual degree of freedom. The rules were not yet settled. The rulebook was still being written. And Musk, who had never been comfortable with rulebooks in any case, was operating in this window of relative openness with an energy that was, in retrospect, precisely calibrated to the moment. What grounded his thinking in a way that distinguished it from mere contrarianism, from the posture of a young man refusing to accept conventional wisdom, simply because he found conventional wisdom aesthetically unsatisfying, was the physics. Always the physics. His undergraduate degree from Penn had not been a credential exercise. He had studied physics with the same absorption he brought to everything that genuinely interested him, which meant that when he interrogated the cost structures of an industry, he was not doing so from a position of ignorance dressed up as insight. He understood, at a level of technical specificity that his interlocutors frequently underestimated, what the physical laws actually permitted. He knew the difference between a cost that was high because matter and energy made it high, and a cost that was high because an industry had organized itself around a supply chain and a set of institutional relationships that happened to produce that cost without anyone having recently asked whether the cost was necessary. The distinction sounds simple. Its application was not. Industries are not organized by accident. The conventions that Musk was interrogating had usually been established by intelligent people working under real constraints, and the constraints were sometimes physical and sometimes financial, and sometimes regulatory and sometimes merely social. And distinguishing between these categories required not just intelligence but a specific kind of epistemic courage, the willingness to be wrong about which constraints were real and to be wrong publicly in front of people who would remember. The obstacle he faced during this period was the credibility gap created by his method itself. First principles thinking, applied to the claims of experts, is experienced by those experts as a challenge to their authority. When a 24-year-old with no industry track record and a sleeping bag in a rented office asks a room of experienced professionals why they have assumed that a given cost is fixed when the underlying physics suggests it might not be, the response is not always philosophical engagement. The response is sometimes dismissal, delivered with the particular condescension that expertise deploys against what it perceives as naivety. And the dismissal stings precisely because it is not entirely unfounded. There are good reasons to trust experience. There are good reasons to treat the accumulated knowledge of an industry as a prior that should not be abandoned without substantial evidence. The 24-year-old asking why has not yet built anything, has not yet failed publicly, has not yet had the experience of discovering that the constraints he dismissed as conventional were in fact real and load-bearing. Musk knew this at some level. The knowledge did not stop him. What it produced, instead, was a sharpening of the method, a greater precision in the questions, a more careful distinction between the claims he was challenging and the reasons he was challenging them, a more systematic approach to the work of separating physical truth from institutional habit. He was, in this period, developing not just a philosophy but a practice, and the practice was being refined in real time by the friction of encounter with people who did not share his framework and who had no particular reason to adopt it. The anecdote that most precisely illuminates this character has the quality of a geometry problem. At some point in the early years of Zip2, Musk became interested in the question of why mapping software was as expensive and as technically limited as it was. The prevailing assumption in the industry was that accurate digital mapping required proprietary data that was expensive to acquire and expensive to maintain, and that the cost of this data was a fundamental constraint on what any mapping product could offer. Musk interrogated this assumption with characteristic thoroughness. He asked what the data actually consisted of at its most basic level. He asked who held it, and why they held it, and what it would cost to acquire the underlying components rather than the packaged product. He asked, in other words, whether the cost was a physical cost or a market cost, whether it reflected what the information actually cost to produce, or what a supplier with pricing power had decided to charge for access to it. The investigation revealed, as these investigations tended to reveal, that the gap between the physical cost and the market cost was substantial. He found paths to the underlying data that the conventional approach had not explored, because the conventional approach had not asked whether exploration was necessary. The solution he arrived at was imperfect and required significant additional engineering work to implement, but it was cheaper, and it worked, and it was arrived at by a method that the industry had not employed, because the industry had not thought to question the constraint that made the method necessary. This is a small story about mapping software. It is also a story about a mind that would later ask the same question about rocket propellant and battery chemistry and tunnel boring and solar panel installation, and a dozen other domains in which the gap between physical cost and market cost had gone unexamined for long enough to be mistaken for a law of nature. The method was the same. The scale changed. The change in scale is the rest of his biography. Kimball watched this process with an admiration that was not uncritical. He had grown up alongside the same encyclopedias and the same Pretoria afternoons, had been formed by some of the same experiences, and possessed a version of his brother's analytical drive that expressed itself differently but was recognizably related. What Kimball understood, and occasionally articulated in conversations that Elon did not always fully receive, was that the first principles method had a blind spot that was itself a kind of first principles failure. The method was superbly equipped to interrogate the physical and economic structure of problems. It was less well equipped, at least in Elon's application of it, to interrogate the human structure, the social and emotional and relational dimensions of the systems he was attempting to change, which were not arbitrary conventions but were often load-bearing in ways that the physics did not capture. People, Kimball would suggest in various formulations during these years, were not optimization problems. The costs they imposed were not always inefficiencies to be engineered around. Sometimes what looked like friction in a system was the system performing a function that was not visible from the vantage point of the engineer who found the friction annoying. Elon heard this. He incorporated it, partially and selectively, into his operating model. He would continue throughout his career to hear it from people who cared about him, and to incorporate it partially and selectively, which is to say he would continue to be surprised, at regular intervals, by the human costs of a method that was very good at reducing physical and economic costs and somewhat less good at accounting for everything else. The framework that was developing in the Palo Alto office, in the code sessions that ran past midnight, and the meetings with skeptical newspaper executives, and the mapping data investigations, and the ongoing conversations with Kimball about what they were building and why, was not yet famous. It had no name and no TED Talk, and no popular business book chapter devoted to its explication. It was simply the way Elon Musk thought about problems, and it was working in the specific and limited context of a small company trying to survive its first year well enough to keep the company alive and moving. What it would eventually produce, not in 1995 or 1996, but in the longer arc that these months were quietly inaugurating, was something that no one in the 400-square-foot office could have specified in advance. The method would scale with the man who had developed it, and the scaling would be, in the precise sense of the word, exponential. The same questions that were being asked about mapping data in Palo Alto would be asked, in a decade, about the cost of lifting mass to orbit. The same insistence on distinguishing physical truth from conventional assumption would be applied to the chemistry of battery cells, and the metallurgy of rocket engines, and the fluid dynamics of hyperloop tubes and the architecture of neural interfaces. All of that was ahead, invisible from where he stood. What was visible, and what was sufficient, was the next problem, and the question that opened it, and the particular quality of attention he brought to the space between the question and its answer. A quality that his collaborators found exhilarating and exhausting in proportions that varied by the person and the day and the hour, and that was already, in these early months, beginning to make clear that the company Kimball and Elon were building together was not going to remain a small operation in a rented office for much longer, and that the growth coming toward them was carrying, alongside the money and the validation and the relief, a set of complications for which the first principles method had not yet developed an adequate response, and which would arrive when they arrived, with the indifference to preparation that only the future can manage. Chapter 18. The Pursuit of U.S. Citizenship, a Geopolitical Requirement. The form was 11 pages long, and it asked questions that no other document in his life had asked. Not the technical questions, the dates of entry, the addresses of residence, the accounting of every departure from and return to United States soil, that the bureaucratic imagination of the Immigration and Naturalization Service required. Those were merely tedious, the kind of tedium that Musk processed with the same systematic efficiency he brought to any information management problem, working backward through years of travel records and lease agreements, and the paper trail of a life lived at high velocity across multiple countries and multiple identities. It was the other questions that held him, briefly, in something approaching stillness. The questions about allegiance, about renunciation, about the specific and irrevocable act of declaring, before a federal officer, and in language that had not changed substantially since the Republic was young, that you were transferring the primary political loyalty of your life from the country of your birth to this one, and that you understood what you were giving up, and that you were giving it up freely. Elon Musk read these questions with the attention he brought to contracts and physics papers and the fine print of venture term sheets, not with sentiment, but not without it either. He had been, in sequence, a South African, a Canadian, and now a permanent resident of the United States. And each of these identities had been adopted not as an expression of belonging, but as an instrument of possibility. South Africa had given him his mind and his formation, and certain scars he would carry permanently. Canada had given him a path out. America had given him everything else: the companies, the capital, the culture of audacious failure that was, he had come to believe, the single most important environmental condition for the kind of work he intended to do. He was not sentimental about nations, in the way that people who have never had to choose a nation tend to be sentimental about them. But he was serious about what citizenship meant in practical terms, and the practical terms in his case were very specific and very high stakes. He needed to be an American citizen, because he intended to build rockets. The year in which Elon Musk became a citizen of the United States was 2002, which means that the pursuit of that citizenship, the years of residency, the green card, the accumulation of the qualifying period, the navigation of an immigration system that processes human beings with the urgency of a geological formation, spans a period considerably longer than the chapter in which it formally concludes. It begins, in the sense that matters, in 1995, when he arrived in California with a student visa and a sleeping bag and a theory about the Internet, and it proceeds through 7 years of building and selling companies and accumulating the kind of profile that immigration officials and FBI background investigators find either very impressive or very complicated, depending on which part of the profile they are examining. The citizenship was not automatic. It was not, in any meaningful sense, easy. It was the product of sustained navigation of a system that is not designed for the convenience of the people moving through it, and it required a quality of patience that Musk did not naturally possess, and therefore had to impose on himself through the recognition that there was no alternative. The America he was living in, during the late 1990s and the early years of the new century, was a country in the process of dramatic self-revision. The dot-com boom had made certain kinds of ambition not merely acceptable but mandatory. The culture of Silicon Valley had infected the broader economic imagination of the country with the idea that any existing industry could be remade from first principles by someone smart enough and fast enough and willing enough to ignore the people explaining why it couldn't be done. Then the bust came, and the revision was revised, and the culture contracted, and the venture capital community that had been funding ideas on the back of napkins began to demand evidence of revenue. and a generation of founders learned the specific and instructive humiliation of watching their valuations collapse in the daylight that followed the speculative fever. Musk had sold Zip2 in 1999 for $307 million and had sold his stake in X.com, which had become PayPal through the particular violence of a corporate merger, for enough money to make him, on paper, the kind of person for whom the ordinary anxieties of life had been permanently restructured. He was 30 years old, and he was worth, depending on the day and the stock price, somewhere in the vicinity of $180 million. He was also, on the morning after the PayPal sale closed in 2002, a man without a company, which was the only condition he found genuinely uncomfortable. The citizenship process had been proceeding in parallel with all of this. Patient, bureaucratic, largely invisible in the public record of his life during these years. Green card holders could live and work in America indefinitely, and many people who qualify for citizenship choose not to pursue it, finding the residency status adequate for their purposes and the renunciation of their birth citizenship more than they wish to give. Musk did not find it adequate. The inadequacy was specific. Defense-related contracts, classified facilities, sensitive technology development, all of these required security clearances that were, in practice, available only to citizens, and sometimes only to citizens with deep and verifiable American roots. The aerospace industry operated behind layers of regulatory and security apparatus that had been constructed during the Cold War and maintained with only minor modifications since, and the apparatus was not indifferent to the nationality of the people attempting to operate within it. If he was going to build rockets in America, using American manufacturing and American supply chains and American launch facilities and eventually American government contracts, he needed to be an American. It was not a philosophical position. It was an engineering requirement. The core conflict in the pursuit of citizenship was not precisely the bureaucratic obstacle, though the bureaucratic obstacle was real and consuming. The deeper conflict was the one that the naturalization form had touched with its questions about allegiance, the question of what it meant to adopt a national identity as an instrument rather than as an inheritance, and whether an identity adopted instrumentally was an identity at all in any sense that the adopting country could reasonably take seriously. Musk did not spend significant visible energy on this question, which is itself a kind of answer. He was constitutionally disinclined toward the kind of introspective hesitation that might have given another person pause at this threshold. He had decided long before the form was in his hands that the nation-state was a useful organizational unit for certain purposes and a limiting one for others, and that his own relationship to national identity would be defined by function rather than by feeling. America was where the work was. The work required citizenship. He would become a citizen. What the application did not capture, and what the naturalization ceremony could not quite contain, was the extent to which his relationship with America was genuinely complicated by the ambivalence that runs beneath the surface of nearly every immigrant's assimilation. The knowledge that the country you are joining is not the country you would have designed, and that joining it requires accepting, at some level, its history and its contradictions and the specific ways in which its promise and its performance have diverged. Musk was not, in the conventional sense, a political thinker. He was interested in systems and in the physics of systems, and governments were systems of a kind he found less tractable than the physical kind, more subject to the irrationalities and historical sedimentations that first principles thinking was least equipped to dissolve. But he was not naive about what America was or about what it had failed to be, and the act of formal allegiance required him to hold all of this simultaneously. The country's extraordinary capacity to generate and fund and protect and reward the kind of ambitious technological work he intended to do, and the country's equally extraordinary capacity to be something considerably less than its founding documents suggested it should aspire to. He held it as he held most things by not holding it too long. The ceremony was the ceremony. The oath was the oath. He was a citizen. The revealing action of this period is not the naturalization itself, but a conversation, recounted in fragments by people who were present or adjacent, that Musk had with immigration attorneys and advisors during the years when the citizenship was being processed. At various points in those consultations, Advisors suggested that the process might be expedited or simplified if he were to reduce the complexity of his profile, to limit certain activities or affiliations or business interests that the background investigation would need to examine to make himself, in the bureaucratic sense, a simpler person. Musk received this advice with the expression that people who worked with him learned to identify as the expression that preceded an unambiguous no. He was not going to simplify himself for the convenience of the process. He was not going to constrain the work he was doing, or the companies he was building, or the directions he was thinking in so that the paperwork would move faster. If the process needed to take longer because he was a complicated applicant, then the process would take longer. He would wait. He would not become less interesting in the interim. This is, in miniature, the same logic he applied to regulatory environments, to government contract requirements, to safety certification processes throughout his subsequent career. A refusal to let the shape of the approval process define the shape of the thing being approved. It made him a difficult applicant, and a difficult contractor, and a difficult partner for institutions that expected the people working within their frameworks to adapt to the framework's requirements. It also made him, eventually, someone who was building things that the frameworks had not anticipated, and for which the frameworks had no adequate response. The difficulty was not incidental to the achievement. It was in some structural sense the same thing. Justine Wilson, whom Musk had met at Queen's University in the early 1990s and married in 2000, was present for the years in which the citizenship application moved through its stages, and her presence in his life during this period illuminates something about the private texture of a man whose public image was already being constructed around his most visible and dramatic qualities. Justine was a writer, which meant she was someone who paid attention to language and to the interior lives of the people around her, and her attention fell on a husband who was not, by temperament, inclined toward the kind of interior disclosure that a writer finds interesting and a biographer finds useful. What she observed, in the years of building and selling and building again, was a man for whom the pursuit of the next thing was so total and so structurally necessary that the space between achievements was experienced less as rest than as a kind of productive anxiety, a state of barely managed impatience with the present tense which was always, for him, merely the anteroom to the future tense he was already inhabiting. The citizenship, when it finally arrived in 2002, did not resolve this anxiety. Nothing external ever did. What it did was remove a specific constraint, open a specific door, and allow the impatience to direct itself at a set of problems that had been waiting, with the patience of very large and very old obstacles, for someone to decide to take them seriously. The door the citizenship opened led toward aerospace, toward the regulatory and contractual and security landscapes that he would now be permitted to navigate as a citizen rather than as a resident. And what was behind those landscapes? The specific technical and financial and organizational challenges of building rockets from first principles, of asking why the cost of reaching orbit was fixed at the number everyone said it was fixed at, and following the answer to its logical conclusion was waiting for him with an indifference to his readiness that the universe reliably maintains. He had the passport now. He had the cleared identity. He had, in the offshore account of his ambition, enough capital to fund the first stages of something that his advisors were already beginning to describe with varying combinations of admiration and alarm as the most expensive idea he had yet had. He had spent 7 years becoming American. He was about to spend the next decade becoming something that had no good existing category, not quite entrepreneur, not quite engineer, not quite explorer, but some compound of all three that the English language had not yet been required to name. The rockets he was imagining were not yet designed. The company that would build them was not yet incorporated. The engineers who would constitute its founding team were not yet hired. But the question had been asked in the first principles way, and the question had been found to have an answer that was different from the answer the industry had agreed to live with. And a man who had just finished 7 years of patient navigation of a bureaucratic system that moved at its own speed and on its own terms was about to demonstrate, in the most literal way available to him, that patience was not the same as passivity, and that the distance between where things were and where they could be was, in the final analysis, a question of thrust. Chapter 19. Social Dynamics and the Early Palo Alto Network. The coffee was bad, and nobody cared. This was, in itself, a kind of cultural data. The coffee at the gatherings that constituted the social infrastructure of early Palo Alto's technology scene, the informal meetups in borrowed conference rooms, the networking dinners at restaurants that were chosen for their proximity and their willingness to accommodate large parties rather than for any culinary distinction, the weekend barbecues in the backyards of people who had recently made enough money to have backyards worth gathering in, was uniformly mediocre, and the mediocrity went unremarked upon because the people drinking it were not there for the coffee. They were there for the information. They were there to know who was building what, and with whose money, and on what timeline, and whether the person across the paper cup was someone who could be useful or someone who needed something, or in the ideal case, both simultaneously. The coffee was a prop. The conversation was the point. Elon Musk stood at the edge of these gatherings in 1995 and 1996 with the particular quality of attention that people who knew him had already learned to identify. Not quite comfortable, not quite uncomfortable, scanning the room with an unhurried deliberateness that was easy to mistake for aloofness, and that was in fact something more purposeful than aloofness. He was doing what he had done since adolescence in Pretoria, when he had telephoned businessmen from the phone directory and asked them questions about their work. He was identifying the people in the room who knew things he needed to know, and he was constructing in real time the most efficient path from his current position to a conversation with those people. The social calculus was not cynical. It was not warm exactly, in the way that natural networkers are warm, with their fluid transitions and their gift for making every person they speak to feel briefly like the most important person in the room. It was direct. He would approach the person he had identified. He would introduce himself. He would ask the question he had come to ask. The conversation that followed would be either useful, or it would be brief. What he was looking for, in those months of bad coffee and borrowed conference rooms, was money. Specifically, he was looking for the particular kind of money that existed in the earliest stage of a startup's life. Angel investment, written on the faith of a person rather than on the evidence of a business. Grounded in the investor's assessment of the founder's mind and conviction rather than in any spreadsheet that the founder could yet produce. Zip2 had been operating on personal credit cards and on the financial support that Elon and Kimball had extracted from their father, Elon Musk, who had contributed an amount in the neighborhood of $28,000 to the venture, a contribution made with the complicated mixture of parental obligation and genuine belief that characterized Errol's relationship with his sons, and one that would later become a point of some narrative contention as the mythology of Musk's origins was constructed and revised. The credit cards were accumulating balances. The office rent was $400 a month. The server costs were manageable but not free. The business needed capital that was not denominated in personal debt. The world into which Musk was trying to insert himself in order to obtain that capital was smaller than it appeared from the outside, and considerably more hierarchical than its egalitarian self-presentation suggested. Silicon Valley in 1996 understood itself as a meritocracy, a place where good ideas found funding on the strength of their goodness, where the right pitch delivered to the right person could transform a sleeping bag operation into a funded company within the time it took to negotiate a term sheet. And this self-understanding was not entirely false. There were genuine examples of ideas finding capital across lines of social distance, of founders without pedigree or connections, making something from nothing by force of vision and competence. But the distribution of that openness was not uniform. The network that determined which ideas got heard and which did not was organized around specific nodes, specific investors, specific university affiliations, specific prior employers. And the people who were most naturally positioned to access those nodes were people who had come through the Stanford pipeline, or who had worked at companies whose founders had become angels, or who had the social fluency to navigate cocktail parties at a level that went beyond identifying the most knowledgeable person in the room and walking directly toward them. Musk had the vision. He had the technical competence. He had a product that was working, at least at the modest scale of its current deployment, and a theory about the Internet's commercial future that was not merely intuitive, but grounded in a reading of economic incentives that he could articulate with unusual precision for a 24-year-old. What he did not have was the social membership that the network regarded as a prerequisite for serious engagement. He was not from Stanford. He had no former employer with a Rolodex full of LP commitments. His South African accent, still present in those years though gradually moderating under the influence of extended American residence, marked him immediately as someone from elsewhere, and elsewhere in the specific social geography of Sand Hill Road was a category that required additional explanation. The hurdle in this precise formulation was trust. Not trust in the technical merits of Zip2, which could be demonstrated to anyone willing to look at the product, but trust in him, in the specific person of Elon Musk, whose intensity could read as either visionary or unstable, depending on the prior disposition of the observer, and whose willingness to engage with the conventions of the fundraising relationship on his own terms rather than on the terms the relationship customarily demanded was an asset with some investors and a liability with others. He had not yet sold a company. He had not yet returned anyone's capital. He had not yet demonstrated, in the specific way that early-stage investors require demonstration, that the qualities he presented in a pitch meeting were the qualities that would survive the contact with execution that a funded company inevitably involved. What he had, and what proved to be sufficient, was the pitch itself. There is an account of Musk's early fundraising conversations that circulated in the Palo Alto network in those years, transmitted in the informal oral history that constitutes much of the connective tissue of startup culture, the stories that angels tell each other over dinner about founders they have met, the assessments that function as both entertainment and due diligence. The account concerns not the content of the pitch, which was relatively standard in its structure but its texture. Musk would arrive at these meetings with a preparation that was evident, but that did not present itself as performance. He had done the work, the market sizing, the competitive analysis, the revenue model, and the work was coherent and internally consistent in a way that reflected genuine thought rather than the assembling of standard pitch deck components. But what distinguished the meetings was what happened when the investor pushed back. Most founders, when an angel investor challenged a projection or questioned an assumption, responded in one of two ways. They either defended the challenged figure with the inflexibility of someone who had rehearsed its defense and could not adjust, or they softened immediately, revising the number downward with the eagerness to please that the investor read correctly, as an absence of genuine conviction. Musk did neither. When his projections were challenged, he engaged with the challenge directly on its merits, asking the investor to specify the assumption underlying the challenge so that he could address that assumption rather than its conclusion. He was willing to revise. He would revise if the investor's reasoning was sound, and he would say so, and he would adjust the number and explain why the adjustment was warranted. But he would not revise because revision was expected, and he would not soften because softening was comfortable, and this quality, the quality of a person who had a view and held it for reasons and would update the view for reasons rather than for social pressure, was recognized by the subset of angels whose own decision-making was similarly structured as something worth investigating further. The money came eventually from Moore Davidow Ventures, which provided the first significant external funding for Zip2 in 1996 in the amount of $3 million. The lead partners at Moore Davidow were not people who were easily impressed by intensity or vision in the abstract. They were experienced enough to have seen intensity and vision fail to translate into business outcomes with sufficient frequency to treat those qualities as necessary but not sufficient conditions for investment. What moved them, in addition to the product and the market analysis, was the specific quality of Musk's engagement with the hard questions, the questions about scalability, about the newspaper industry's willingness to pay for what Zip2 was selling, about the competitive landscape that was beginning to form as other companies recognized the same opportunity he had recognized. He did not make the hard questions easy. He made them precise. And precision, in the angel and early venture community, was a form of credibility that transcended the normal social prerequisites. Kimball's role in the fundraising process was, again, the role he occupied in the Musk operation generally, the role of translation and temperature. He was the person who could read the room in the way that Elon could not or would not, who could feel the moment when a meeting was going too intense and introduce a lighter register without losing the substance of the conversation, who could walk an investor to the door and leave them with a feeling of having been in the presence of something genuine rather than something merely determined. The brothers had developed, through the years of shared work and shared adversity, a kind of operational fluency, an ability to cover for each other's gaps in real time, without the negotiation that such coverage usually requires, that served them well in a fundraising environment where both the analytical and the interpersonal dimensions of a meeting had to succeed for the outcome to be positive. The Moore Davidow investment changed Zip2 in ways that were immediately visible, and in ways that were less immediately visible and considerably more consequential. The immediately visible change was the money itself, $3 million, which meant servers and salaries, and the ability to hire engineers who did not sleep in the office, which meant the company could scale at a rate that the credit card model had not permitted. The less immediately visible change was structural. External investment came with a board. A board came with governance. Governance came with the expectation that the founder's decisions would be subject to review by people who had a fiduciary stake in the outcome and a different time horizon than the founder, and a set of professional instincts about how companies at this stage of development should be run. Instincts that had been formed by experience with other companies and other founders, and that were not, by definition, calibrated to the specific genius or the specific difficulty of this particular founder. Musk had not thought carefully about this when he took the money. He had thought carefully about almost everything else: the market, the technology, the competitive position, the revenue model, the hiring plan. The governance implications of external investment were not, in the moment of the closing, the dimension of the transaction that commanded his attention. They would command it later, with an urgency that no amount of first principles analysis had prepared him for, when the board that had been constituted partly as a condition of the investment began to exercise the authority that board seats convey, and when the vision of the company that the investors were attempting to optimize for turned out to be a vision that diverged, in certain critical respects, from the vision in Elon Musk's head. That divergence was still forming in the autumn of 1996, as the Moore Davidow money arrived and the company began to expand, and the bad coffee at the Palo Alto networking events was replaced in Musk's social calendar by the slightly better coffee of board meetings and investor updates, and the more formal machinery of a funded startup finding its footing. He had gotten what he needed from the network. The network, in turn, had gotten what it always extracted from the people who successfully navigated it: not merely equity in a company, but a claim on the future of a founder whose trajectory was only beginning to reveal the scale of what it would eventually reach, and whose relationship with the people who held that claim was about to become considerably more complicated than either party had fully accounted for in the clean language of the term sheet they had both signed. Chapter 20. Launching Zip2, the global directory concept. The newspaper arrived every morning, and every morning it was already out of date. This was not a new observation. Journalists and media critics had been making versions of it for decades, acknowledging the structural lag built into the print cycle as an acceptable cost of the medium's other virtues: its depth, its portability, its capacity for the kind of sustained narrative that a broadcast could not accommodate. But in the autumn of 1995, sitting in the 400-square-foot office in Palo Alto with a copy of a major metropolitan daily spread across the desk that also served some nights as the proximate surface to his sleeping bag, Elon Musk was looking at the newspaper with a different quality of attention. He was not reading it. He was auditing it. He was examining the classified section and the business directory and the local listings with the eye of someone who understood, at a level of technical and economic specificity that the newspaper's own management had not yet fully internalized, that every one of these pages represented a revenue stream that was in the process of migrating to a new substrate, and that the migration was going to happen whether or not the newspapers chose to manage it, and that the newspapers did not yet know this with sufficient urgency to have done anything useful about it. What he saw, spread across the newsprint under the Palo Alto light, was not a newspaper. It was a problem with a solution that he was in the process of building. The idea that would become Zip2 had a clarity to it that Musk found rare and therefore valuable. Most business ideas, in his assessment, were complicated by ambiguity: about the market, about the technology, about the revenue model, about the customer's actual willingness to pay for the thing being offered versus their expressed interest in it. Zip2 had ambiguity in the details, but not in the structure. The structure was simple to the point of being almost self-evident, once you held the right two facts in your head simultaneously. The first fact was that the internet was going to become the primary medium through which people found local businesses, local services, and local information, not eventually, not in some speculative future, but soon within a horizon that was already visible to anyone paying attention to the adoption curves. The second fact was that local newspapers possessed, in their existing advertising relationships and their accumulated directories of local business information, exactly the asset that would be required to build a useful local internet product. If only that asset could be digitized and made searchable and connected to a mapping interface that allowed users to find not just what was near them but how to get there. The newspapers had the content. He had the technology. The transaction that connected these two facts was Zip2's business model, and the model had the quality that Musk most admired in engineered systems. It was elegant in the sense that it achieved a complex outcome through a mechanism that was, once understood, obviously correct. The America in which he was trying to execute this model was in the grip of a particular kind of collective excitement that had not yet learned its own name. The word .com had not yet acquired the cultural saturation it would achieve by 1999, nor had it acquired the retrospective irony that the crash of 2000 would permanently attach to it. In 1995 and 1996, the excitement was still in its sincere phase, the phase before the money became so excessive and the valuation so untethered from any conceivable revenue reality that the whole apparatus began to feel, even to its participants, more like a performance of wealth creation than the thing itself. In this earlier, more earnest moment, people who were building internet companies were largely building them because they believed, with a conviction that the available evidence supported, that the internet was going to change the structure of commerce and communication in fundamental ways, and that the companies positioned correctly at the beginning of that change would capture value at a scale that the existing economy had no framework for evaluating. Musk believed this with the specific quality of conviction that distinguished his beliefs from ordinary optimism, the quality of having reasoned his way to the conclusion from first principles rather than having absorbed it from the ambient enthusiasm of the culture around him. He had been thinking about the economic implications of digital networks before the cultural moment caught up to the technology, and the fact that the culture was now catching up did not make his version of the belief less rigorous. It made it more valuable, because he had arrived at the conclusion through a process that gave him a map of the territory that the enthusiasts, who had arrived at the same destination by a different route, did not possess. The obstacle that Zip2 confronted in its early operational phase was not technical, though the technical challenges were real. The obstacle was institutional. Newspapers in the mid-1990s were not startups. They were, in many cases, century-old institutions with cultures that had been formed by the specific rhythms and requirements of print journalism, cultures that valued deliberation, that had developed extensive internal processes for evaluating change, and that were managed by people whose professional formation had occurred entirely within the pre-internet media landscape, and who therefore understood the internet primarily as a threat rather than as an opportunity, or who understood it as an opportunity in the abstract while finding every specific proposal for acting on that opportunity to be somehow premature, or insufficiently proven, or structurally incompatible with existing advertiser relationships, or in need of further review by a committee that would meet quarterly. Musk encountered this institutional resistance with a frequency and a consistency that would have discouraged a person less committed to the underlying logic of his position. He was 24 years old, calling on organizations that had been in business since before his parents were born, asking them to give him money and their brand and their advertiser relationships in exchange for a technology product that he would build and maintain, and that would, he promised them, position them advantageously for a digital transition that had not yet fully arrived. The ask was large. The trust required to fulfill the ask was larger. And trust, as he had learned in the Palo Alto networking scene, was not distributed on the basis of the quality of one's reasoning alone. The specific anecdote that opens the keyhole into his character during this period concerns a sales call, one of dozens, perhaps hundreds, that he and Kimball made during the months when Zip2's survival depended on converting newspaper skepticism into signed contracts. The call was with a mid-sized metropolitan paper whose classified advertising revenue was significant, and whose management was aware, in the vague and uncomfortable way of institutions that have received early warning they are not yet prepared to act upon, that the internet represented some kind of challenge to their existing model. The meeting had been arranged through a contact, attended at the level of middle management, and proceeded through the first portion of its agenda with the polite attention that newspaper executives extended to technology vendors who had not yet demonstrated sufficient scale to be taken seriously as strategic partners. Musk was asked at some point in the meeting what comparable newspapers had already signed with Zip2. The honest answer was that the client list was short, that Zip2 was an early-stage company with limited deployments, and that the newspaper being addressed was being approached in part because its signing would provide the social proof that would make the next conversation easier. This is a standard situation in enterprise sales, and the standard response involves some combination of name-dropping the clients that do exist, emphasizing the quality of the technology over the quantity of the deployments, and deploying whatever personal credibility the sales team can bring to bear to compensate for the thinness of the reference list. Kimball, who was in the room, was prepared to execute this standard response with the social fluency that was his particular contribution to these encounters. Musk answered the question differently. He told them, with the directness that his advisors had repeatedly suggested he moderate for sales contexts, that the client list was at an early stage, that the newspaper in the room had an opportunity to be among the first movers rather than among the followers who would eventually adopt the technology under competitive pressure, and that first movers in technological transitions historically captured disproportionate advantage over their markets. Then he showed them the product. He walked them through the mapping interface and the search functionality and the business directory architecture with the fluency of someone who had built it himself, who understood not just what it did but why it did it, and what the engineering decisions underlying each feature were, and what those decisions implied about the product's scalability and its capacity for future development. He did not pitch. He demonstrated. He treated them as intelligent people who were capable of evaluating evidence and reaching correct conclusions, which was either the most respectful thing a salesperson could do or the most commercially naive, depending on the intelligence of the people in the room. The newspaper did not sign that day. Several weeks later, after additional conversations that Kimball managed with considerable diplomatic skill, they did sign. The sequence, Elon's unvarnished demonstration, Kimball's patient follow-through, the eventual conversion of institutional skepticism into contractual commitment, became the operational template for Zip2's sales process, and it worked often enough to build a client roster that began, with the more Davido investment behind it, to accumulate genuine momentum. Kimball's role in this period was not merely complementary. It was, in a structural sense, necessary in a way that Elon did not always fully acknowledge, and that Kimball did not often articulate, because articulating it would have required a kind of explicit negotiation about the partnership's terms that neither brother was inclined toward. They operated on the basis of a shared understanding that had developed over years of proximity, and that functioned well enough under conditions of scarcity and alignment. The conditions of scarcity were genuine. The alignment was, at this stage, nearly complete. They were building the same thing toward the same end, and the differences in their methods were complementary rather than conflicting. And the sleeping bag office, and the bad coffee, and the newspaper meetings that went sideways, and the ones that eventually went right, were shared experiences in the specific sense that they were shaping both of them simultaneously, depositing in each brother a set of formative memories and hard-won lessons that would inform every subsequent professional relationship either of them would have. What was also being deposited less visibly was a set of expectations about how the company would be run and who would run it. The venture capital money had arrived with a board, and the board had arrived with its own institutional logic, and the institutional logic was beginning to express itself in conversations about management structure and about whether the person who had written the code and conceived the product was necessarily the same person who should be managing the company as it scaled. These conversations were still early and still relatively oblique in 1996, conducted in the careful language that experienced investors use when they are beginning to form a view about a founder's operational limitations, but have not yet decided to act on that view. Musk could sense their direction without being able to specify their destination, and the sensation was uncomfortable in a way he did not have a ready framework for processing, because the discomfort was not technical and not economic but political. And political discomfort was the variety he was least equipped by temperament and by training to manage with the patience that management required. The company was growing. The client list was growing. The technology was improving, rebuilt in significant sections by the engineering team that the venture money had allowed him to hire, a team whose professional formation had given them a fluency in software architecture that made Musk's early codebase look, in certain respects, like the work of someone who had been solving the right problem with the wrong tools. The rebuilding was necessary, and he knew it was necessary, and he accepted its necessity with less grace than the engineers who were doing the rebuilding might have hoped for, because acceptance in his operational vocabulary had never been equivalent to comfort. The product he had imagined in the Palo Alto office, the newspaper's digital future, the local directory rendered searchable and mappable and commercial, the bridge between the physical geography of a city and the emerging geography of the internet, was becoming real in a form that was recognizably descended from the original vision, even if the path from concept to deployment had required revisions that the original vision had not anticipated. That was, in the end, what building something always required: the revision of the vision in contact with the reality of the material, the willingness to hold the essential idea stable while everything else changed around it. The essential idea was stable. Everything else was changing faster than the board had expected, and faster perhaps than Musk himself had fully accounted for. And the gap between the pace of the company's growth and the pace at which its internal governance could adapt to that growth was widening, quietly and with the momentum of a process that had been set in motion by the term sheet that Musk had signed without reading its implications with quite the same first principles rigor he brought to everything else. And that gap was about to produce, in the offices of Zip2, and in the boardroom that had been constituted to oversee it, the first serious test of whether the person who built a thing was the same person who should be trusted to run it at scale. A test that Musk was about to fail in the specific and instructive way that would teach him, at considerable personal cost, lessons about power and governance and the distance between founding and leading that no physics textbook had ever thought to include.